Greetings folks, Iolair here. In this video I'll be talking about taking IFHE on secondary builds, and I will factor in the impact of the IFHE changes that were rolled out in early 2020. Now I did touch on this subject in a video this time last year, specifically for the Bismarck and Tirpitz when they received the 1/4 penetration buff to their 105mm secondaries. Now that video has gotten a lot of views, and I suspect that quite a few viewers are looking for more general guidance across all of the nations where secondary builds are viable, and so that's what I'm looking to try to provide guidance in this video. Now, speaking of which, I am going to concentrate on just the nations and ships where secondary builds are deemed, quote, viable, which means secondary ranges that can get out beyond 10 kilometers. So that means only specific nations and even specific ships within specific nations, and generally tier 8 and higher. I will touch on the Gneisenau and Scharnhorst since secondary builds on those ships are also quite popular. So the too long didn't read version of this is don't bother to take IFHE on secondary builds. The general consensus of the community and community contributors, etc., is that it's not worth the investment for the limited benefit it does give on some ships. But if you want to get into the specifics of the nations and break down on a nation and ship by ship basis, stay tuned for that. Okay, so before I get to individual nations, I want to touch relatively briefly on key surfaces that we need to consider here, because we want IFHE, if we're going to take it, to be able to increase the number of and types of surfaces that the secondaries will be able to penetrate. There are lots of variations here, but thematically, these are the key surfaces that we tend to see. So the first one is 16 millimeters. This is what we see for mid-tier destroyer hulls, as well as mid-tier cruiser bows and sterns. This is what, by mid-tier, I mean up through tier 7. 16 millimeters is also what we see for upper-tier cruiser superstructures. 19 millimeters is one of these, quote, magic thresholds that is quite ubiquitous in the game. This is what we see for upper tier battleship superstructures, as well as the vast majority of upper tier destroyer surfaces. The next threshold is 25 millimeters. This is very common on upper tier cruiser bows and sterns. There are some significant exceptions here, which is why I have an asterisk. So, for example, the upper tier German and U.S. Navy heavy cruisers have 27 millimeter surfaces that are now no longer vulnerable to IFHE based 127 millimeter guns. The next threshold is 26 millimeters. This is what we see for mid-tier battleship bows and sterns. This means up through tier 7, so things like Colorado, Nagato, Sinop, Gneisenau, etc. And then the last threshold, which again I've highlighted because it's one of these, quote, magic thresholds, is 32 millimeters. And this is what we see for the bows and sterns and a lot of plating on upper tier battleships. So the first nation I want to touch on is U.S. Navy. There's one shell size here to consider, which is 127 millimeters. Without IFHE, the penetration is 21 millimeters. With IFHE, it's 26. And the guidance here from me is that it's arguably useful, I should say, on the Massachusetts, which tends to see more mid-tier ships than the other two ships here on this list. I personally still think it's too high of an investment, but depending upon your personal experience and how you like to play and so on, this might be something that you want to consider. For the Georgia and the Ohio, which see very few, if any, mid-tier ships, just to get the 26 millimeter penetration for, the upper tier cruiser surfaces is generally considered, and I consider, too much of an investment. And so my recommendation here is to not bother taking IFHE on those ships. The next nation I want to touch on are the Germans. There are 3 shell sizes to consider here: 105, 128, and 150. You can see the before and after for the IFHE impact of taking or not taking it and taking it. The Bismarck, Tirpitz, Friedrich der Große, and the recently introduced Pommern all have 105 millimeter secondaries. There might be an argument to take IFHE to bump that penetration to 32 millimeters. I would not recommend it on the Bismarck and Tirpitz because they see a lot of mid-tier ships, and getting the 32 millimeter penetration is of limited value. It's in my mind, it's more valuable to have the better fire chance. The Friedrich der Große and the Pommern, which tend to see more higher tier ships and higher upper tier battleships, there might be a stronger argument there, but again, still, my opinion, it's too high of an investment. The Germans get such good penetration benefit out of the box without IFHE. It's a very hard argument to make, in my opinion. Now, for other German battleships that have secondaries that are at least 128 millimeters, so this includes the Odin, the Große Kurfürst, they all have secondaries of at least 128 millimeters. And that gets 32 millimeters of penetration without IFHE. So the general recommendation there, certainly from me, is don't bother taking it there. It's definitely not worth the investment. I will note here that the Bravo hull of the Gneisenau has entirely 128 millimeter secondaries, so definitely not recommended to take IFHE there. And then for the Scharnhorst has 105 as well as 150 millimeter secondaries. And again, she tends to see a lot of mid-tier ships, so I would not recommend on taking IFHE for the Scharnhorst either. Next, I want to touch on France. There are 3 shell sizes here: 100 millimeters, 127, and 152. The 100 millimeter is very prevalent on the Richelieu, Alsace, Jean Bart, and Bourgogne. The 127 is only exists on the République, and the 152 millimeter guns exist on all of the ships I just mentioned for France. There is, again, an argument to be made here based on the before and after for taking IFHE. But again, here my opinion is that the investment is too high for 2 reasons. One is it's a lot of investment for significant specialization. And secondly, my view is that the French battleships are not the best at sort of the frontline brawling experience. I run tank concealment builds on my French battleships, so I generally would not recommend IFHE on France. But again, depending upon how you might play, there is an argument potentially to be made here to take IFHE. The last nation I want to touch on is Japan. There are 2 shell sizes to consider here, 127 and 155. Again, like with France, there is potentially an argument to be made. I should point out here that we're talking about specifically the Izumo, Musashi, and Yamato, which all can get their secondaries out beyond 10 kilometers. The Amagi and Ki at tier 8 don't have that level of range, so I'm not considering them here. So I am, again, would not recommend IFHE for these ships, but depending upon how you like to play and the benefit of IFHE in terms of penetration, maybe for you there's an argument to be made, but I think for the majority of players, it would not be recommended. Okay, so that's going to pretty well wrap it up. Again, I wanted to provide a pretty concise level of input and feedback here. Hopefully the information here was useful and interesting. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comments below. I love hearing from the audience. And as always, we hope to see you out there on the virtual seas, and we wish you happy sailing.
Run.